The ground was shaking, and the air was filled with smoke. Explosions flashed in the distance, lighting up the dark sky. Kareth lay on the battlefield. Her armor cracked, her skin burned, her breathing heavy, the smell of blood and metal mixed. In the air, she could hear the screams of her people fading. One by one, the war was lost, and she knew it. Her hands trembled as she tried to lift her weapon. But it was broken, just like the hope in her heart. The humans had come with fire and thunder, their weapons louder and deadlier than anything her people had seen before. She had fought for hours. Maybe days' time had no meaning here. Every muscle in her body screamed in pain. She had been a warrior since she could walk, trained to never surrender. But now, there was no fight left. She turned her head and saw the ground covered in black dust and broken bodies. Friends she had known since childhood now lay silent. The wind carried the distant sound of marching boots. The humans were coming to finish what they started. Kareth's vision blurred. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the acceptance of the end. She closed her eyes, ready to meet the darkness for a moment. There was nothing, no pain, no sound, no light then. Warmth, it was strange. She could feel softness under her back. The smell of smoke was gone, replaced by something new, fresh bread. Her eyes opened slowly. Light poured in through a small window, gentle and golden. A face hovered above her. Human. Her first instinct was to attack. She tried to move her arm, to grab something, anything. But her strength betrayed her. The human stepped back a little, hands open, showing no weapon. He spoke, his voice low and careful. The words were strange to her ears, but the tone was not that of an enemy. Kareth blinked, trying to understand. She remembered falling, bleeding, ready to die. How was she here? Why was she still alive? Her people had told her humans never spared enemies, yet here she was, lying on something soft, covered with a warm blanket. She moved her head and saw the room. The walls were made of wood, old but strong. A small table held strange objects, glass jars, metal tools, and a pot with steam rising from it. The human walked to the table and poured water into a cup. He came closer and held it out to her. She hesitated, her eyes locked on his. There was no hate there, only concern. Her throat burned with thirst. She took the cup with shaking hands and drank slowly. The water was clean, cool, and tasted like life itself. She looked at him again. His clothes were simple, his face tired, but his eyes were steady. Why was he helping her? Kareth tried to speak. Her voice was rough and weak. She said something in her own language. The human tilted his head, not understanding. But he smiled, just a little. It was the first smile she had seen in what felt like forever. Her mind screamed at her not to trust him. This could be a trick. Maybe he was keeping her alive for questioning or worse. But something deep inside her whispered that this was different. That maybe, for the first time in her life, she was not just an enemy to someone. Her eyes grew heavy again. The pain was still there, but the warmth and the strange sense of safety were stronger. She let her head sink into the pillow. Before darkness took her again, she heard the human speak softly. The words meant nothing to her, but the tone. It was the tone of someone saying, "You're safe now." And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because Kareth wasn't sure she wanted to believe it. Kareth woke again. This time there was no shaking ground, no smell of fire. Only the quiet sound of wind outside, and the soft creak of wood beneath her. Her body ached, but it was a different kind of ache, less sharp, more like the slow reminder of wounds healing. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the room. It was small, but filled with things she did not understand. Metal pots hung above. A stove, a shelf held strange books, and a square object on the table showed a frozen image of a smiling human family. Kareth frowned. Humans smiled in pictures? Why would warriors pose like that? The human from before entered the room. He carried a tray with a bowl of steaming food. The smell was unlike anything she knew, warm, rich, almost inviting. He placed it beside her bed and stepped back. His hands were empty again, always showing He had no weapon. She sat up slowly, hissing in pain as her side throbbed. The human said something in his language. His tone was calm, like he was telling her to be careful. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at him, trying to read his face. Was this kindness real? She remembered stories told by her people. Humans were ruthless, efficient killers who took no prisoners. Yet here she was, alive in a human's home, and he was cooking for her. Kareth reached for the bowl. The human watched her carefully, almost like he feared she might collapse again. She lifted the spoon awkwardly. Her people used their hands or flat stones for eating, not curved metal. The food was soft, easy to chew. It warmed her from the inside. She tried not to show it, but she couldn't stop the small sigh of relief. The human smiled. It was a strange expression, half joy, half something she couldn't name. He said a word slowly, pointing to the bowl. Soup. Kareth narrowed her eyes. Was that the name of the food? She repeated it under her breath, her accent twisting the sound. The human nodded, pleased. It was the first word they shared. Days passed. She grew stronger. Though her wounds still burned when she moved too quickly, she noticed the human Daniel. She had learned his name kept the windows covered at night. When footsteps passed outside, he would pause and listen until they were gone. Once, she saw him speak in low tones to another human at the door. His body blocked her from view the entire time. Kareth understood then. He was hiding her from his own people. But why? That night, she tried to leave. She waited until he slept in a chair beside the door. Her steps were slow, her body weak. The cold air outside hit her like a blade. She had taken only a few steps before her knees buckled. Her vision went white. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Daniel carried her back inside without a word. He wrapped her in blankets and checked her wounds again. When he saw no new bleeding, he simply shook his head with a sigh. Kareth stared at him, confused. No anger, no punishment, only concern. The next morning, she woke to find new bandages on her arm and side. Her armor was gone, replaced with soft human fabric. It felt strange against her skin, but it was warm. She hated to admit it. Yet each day, the room felt less like a prison and more like a shelter. Still, she kept her guard. When he spoke, she listened for lies. When he smiled, she searched his eyes for a hidden trap. But the days kept passing, and nothing happened. No chains, no interrogations, only food, water, warmth, and the sound of his voice trying to teach her new words. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, Kareth sat by the small fire while Daniel worked at the table. He hummed softly, a strange sound that reminded her of river water flowing over stones. She realized with a sudden jolt that she no longer thought of him as the human. He was Daniel, the one who had saved her, the one who was risking something she did not yet understand, and deep inside, where her warrior's heart had built walls for years, a tiny crack had formed. She didn't know if it was hope or danger, but she couldn't look away from it. The days passed slowly. Kareth's wounds began to close, leaving dark scars across her skin. She still moved carefully, every step reminding her of the battle she had lost. But the sharp pain that once kept her from breathing was now a dull ache. Daniel continued to speak to her. His words were strange, but his voice was steady. Sometimes he would point to objects, a cup, a chair, the door, and say their names slowly. Kareth would repeat them, often getting the sound wrong. Daniel never grew angry. He only smiled and tried again. At first, she thought it pointless. Why learn the tongue of an enemy? But as the days turned into weeks, she realized something. The words gave her power. Every new word was a weapon in a different kind of battle. A battle for understanding. She still couldn't tell him her story. The words weren't enough for that yet, but sometimes she would gesture, drawing shapes in the air, acting out small scenes. Daniel would watch closely, his brow furrowed. Sometimes he understood, sometimes he laughed. A sound so strange and soft, it made her stomach twist. In a way she didn't like to admit. The house was small, one main room, a small kitchen, and a sleeping space where she rested. Daniel worked during the day, mending tools, fixing broken machines brought by neighbors. Kareth stayed inside, hidden. Through the small window, she watched the snow pile higher each day. She wondered if this human home was like a cage, a warm cage, but still a cage. Sometimes she caught Daniel watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. It was the same way she found herself watching him, studying the way his hands moved, how his eyes followed the fire when he was lost in thought. It was dangerous, she told herself. This kind of attention made warriors weak. One evening, while Daniel cooked, she sat near the table. The smell of food filled the air. She noticed his hands scarred, rough from work, the hands of someone who had lived through more than one kind of battle. He caught her staring. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Then Daniel gave a small smile and pushed a piece of bread toward her, a silent offering. She took it, feeling the warmth of it in her palm. But the silence between them was not empty. It was full of things they didn't have the words for yet, a kind of peace that neither of them trusted, yet neither wanted to break. One night the peace shattered. Kareth was half asleep when she heard footsteps outside, not the slow, familiar sound of Daniel. These were heavy, sharp boots. Voices followed, speaking quickly in human words she couldn't understand. Daniel moved to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to look. His jaw tightened. He turned to her and made a quick gesture. Stay. He moved around the room, blowing out the lamps. The house fell into darkness except for the fire's glow. Kareth's instincts screamed danger. She reached for something to use as a weapon. Her hand found a metal rod by the stove. Daniel saw it and shook his head firmly. He pointed to the small trapdoor under the rug. She hesitated. His eyes locked on hers. The silent command was clear-eyed. She climbed down into the narrow space. It was dark and cold, the air smelling of earth and wood. Above her, the trapdoor closed. She heard the front door open. Voices spoke sharply. Daniel answered in short, calm tones. Kareth pressed her ear to the floor. She couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the tension. At one point, a soldier's voice grew louder, almost shouting. Her grip tightened on the metal rod. She was ready to burst out if they heard him. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the voices faded. The door shut. Silence returned. The trapdoor opened and Daniel looked down at her. He reached a hand to help her out. For a moment, she thought about refusing, staying in the dark to keep herself safe. But she took his hand. Back in the light, she searched his face for answers. He only shook his head and gave a small, tired smile. No words, no explanation, only the quiet truth between them. He had just protected her again, and she still didn't know why. That night, Kareth lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of the fire and the steady breathing of the human who had saved her twice. The language they shared was still broken, but the silence between them, it was starting to speak louder than words. Snow still covered the ground. The days felt quiet, almost too quiet. Kareth stayed inside, hidden in the small wooden house, but she could feel the danger growing outside. It was in the way Daniel moved faster now, checking the window more often. It was in the way voices outside seemed sharper, more urgent. Something was changing, and not for the better. One morning, while Daniel was repairing a machine in the corner, she heard heavy boots on the frozen path. They stopped near the house. She tensed, every muscle ready to spring. Two shadows moved past the window. Voices followed, low but filled with suspicion. Kareth didn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. She knew the tone of a hunter searching for prey. Daniel froze, his eyes meeting hers. He gave a small shake of his head, telling her to stay calm, but she could see it in his face. He was worried. The voices outside grew louder for a moment, then faded as the footsteps moved on. Kareth relaxed slightly, but not completely. She knew they would come back that night. While Daniel slept in the chair near the fire, Kareth looked at the door. She thought about leaving, disappearing into the forest before the soldiers found her. It would keep Daniel safe, but then she remembered the snow, the cold, the weakness still in her body. She wouldn't last long alone, and deep inside, she knew another truth. She didn't want to leave. 2 days later, the danger returned. Stronger than before, Daniel came inside with his face pale and tense. He spoke quickly, pointing to the window, then to her. Kareth caught only a few words but understood enough. The soldiers were searching every house. Someone had told them an alien was hiding nearby. Her heart pounded. If they found her here, Daniel would suffer too. She wanted to tell him to hand her over, to save himself, but the words weren't there. And even if they were, she wasn't sure she could say them. That evening, they sat in silence. Daniel stared into the fire. Kareth sat on the bed, her mind restless. She remembered the battlefield, the way humans had shown no mercy, and yet, this human had shown her more mercy than her own commanders ever had. The thought twisted something deep inside her. Later, when Daniel stepped outside to bring in more firewood, Kareth moved to the window. The snow reflected the moonlight. In the distance, she saw the glow of torches moving from house to house. The soldiers were close, closer than ever. When Daniel came back in, she pointed toward the lights and made a questioning gesture. He nodded grimly. They were coming. He moved quickly, pulling out blankets and supplies. Then he pointed to the trapdoor under the rug again. She shook her head. Last time she had hidden without a choice. This time, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Daniel's voice grew urgent. He spoke her name slowly, clearly so she would understand. Then he pointed to the floor again. His eyes pleaded with her. She didn't want him to risk more for her, but she saw no other choice. The footsteps outside grew louder. Men's voices called out orders. The door shook under a heavy knock. Karetha's body reacted before her mind did. She climbed down into the darkness. Daniel closed the trapdoor and covered it with the rug. The cold earth surrounded her. Above, she heard the door open. The soldiers stepped inside. Their voices filled the room above her. Heavy boots moved across the floor. She held her breath. The sound of chairs scraping, boxes being opened. One soldier's step stopped directly above her hiding place. Her grip on the dirt tightened. She imagined them finding the trapdoor, pulling it open. Her body tensed, ready to fight even with nothing but her bare hands. Then Daniel's voice came, calm but firm. He spoke for a long time. The soldiers responded with sharp, questioning tones. There was a pause. Then boots moved toward the door. The voices faded. The door closed. The trapdoor lifted. Daniel looked down, his face pale but still steady. He reached for her, pulling her up into the light. Kareth stood there, her heart still pounding. She looked at him for a long time. She wanted to ask why he kept risking himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she gave him the smallest nod. It was her way of saying something she didn't yet know how to say. I see what you're doing, and I won't forget outside. The soldiers moved on to the next house, but Kareth knew they would return. And next time, hiding might not be enough. Asterisk. The fire crackled softly. Kareth sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the flames. The soldiers had left hours ago, but the echo of their boots still haunted her ears. Daniel sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a mug of steaming drink. Neither of them spoke for a long time. She wanted to ask him, why? Why keep her safe when it put his life in danger? But the words were still not enough, even if she could speak them. She wasn't sure she could look him in the eyes while asking. Daniel glanced at her, then looked back at the fire. His face was calm, but she could see the tiredness in his eyes, the weight of secrets. Finally, he set down the mug and reached for something on the shelf. A small metal box, worn and dented. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside were a few objects: a folded piece of paper, a small necklace with a silver pendant, and a photograph. Kareth's eyes went to the photograph first. It showed Daniel standing beside a young human woman. The woman's smile was bright, her hair tied back. Daniel was younger in the picture, his face less tired. He tapped the photograph and spoke. A name. His voice was soft, almost breaking. Kareth tilted her head. She pointed to the woman, then to him. He nodded. She understood enough. This was someone important to him. Daniel pointed to the pendant. He picked it up and let it hang. Between them, the silver caught the firelight. Then he placed it gently in Kareth's palm. The metal was cold. She looked at him, confused. He took a deep breath and began to speak slowly. His words were broken into simple pieces, like he was building a bridge from his world to hers. Kareth caught only parts, but she understood the meaning in his eyes, in the pauses between words. Woman in the picture, his sister, was dead, not because of aliens, not because of war between their species, but because of humans, Daniel's own people. He pointed toward the window, to the distant lights of the settlement. He spoke with bitterness now. Kareth realized his sister had been killed by soldiers from his own side, the same kind now hunting for Kareth. Her breath caught. She had been told humans were one thing, only merciless enemies. But Daniel was showing her another truth. Humans could be enemies to each other too. And maybe, just maybe, they could also be protectors. He looked at her and placed his hand over his chest. Then he said something slowly. The words were unfamiliar, but the way he said them made her feel their weight. It was a promise, a vow to protect. For a moment, neither moved. The fire filled the silence between them. Kareth looked down at the pendant still in her hand. Her people would say this was a weakness, letting an enemy's grief matter to her. But she didn't feel weak. She felt something else, something dangerous, trust, that night. She didn't sleep. She lay awake, turning the pendant in her fingers. Daniel's story played in her mind again and again. Every time she had doubted his kindness, every moment she thought he was lying. Now she saw it differently. He wasn't protecting her out of pity. He was protecting her because he refused to let the same kind of cruelty happen again. In the early hours before dawn, Kareth rose quietly. She walked to the table where the photograph and box still lay. She placed the pendant back inside. It wasn't hers to keep, but she touched it once more, pressing her fingers against the cold metal, a silent thank you. When Daniel woke, he found her sitting near the fire. She met his eyes. No words were needed. He seemed to understand anyway. For the first time since she had arrived in his home, they didn't feel like two enemies, hiding from each other. They felt like two survivors, standing on the same side. Outside, the snow kept falling, but Kareth knew the real storm was coming. The soldiers would not stop. The danger would not fade, and now, she was no longer thinking only of herself. If they came again, she wouldn't just hide. She would fight. Not for her people, not for revenge, but for the human who had made her see the truth. The wind howled outside. Snow blew against the windows, rattling the wooden frame. Kareth sat near the fire, sharpening a small piece of metal she had found in the kitchen. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. Daniel watched her from the table, his hands busy repairing a broken lantern. He didn't tell her to stop. He knew why she was doing it. The danger had been growing for days. The soldiers had been seen again, searching more houses, asking more questions. It was only a matter of time before they came back. That evening, the glow of torches appeared in the distance. Kareth saw them through the small gap in the curtain. Her chest tightened. They were moving from house to house, and now they were only a few doors away. Daniel stood. He grabbed the rug in the middle of the floor and pulled it aside. The trapdoor was waiting. He pointed to it, his face tense. Kareth shook her head. Not this time. His eyes narrowed. He spoke her name slowly, firmly. Then he pointed again, this time with more force, but Kareth stayed where she was. She could not hide while he faced the soldiers alone. The sound of boots crunched closer through the snow. Kareth stepped toward Daniel, placing a hand on his arm. She pointed to herself, then to the door. His eyes widened. He shook his head sharply, but she didn't look away. For a moment, neither moved. Only the sound of the wind filled the space between them. Then Daniel spoke quietly. It wasn't a command this time. It was a plea. She understood enough. wanted her safe, no matter what happened to him. But Kareth had made her choice. She would not let him stand between her and danger again. Not after everything he had done for her. The knocking came loud, hard. The door shuddered under the force. A voice shouted from outside. Kareth couldn't understand the words, but the tone was sharp and commanding. Daniel stepped toward the door, but Kareth moved first. She gripped the metal shard in her hand and stood beside him. He looked at her. In his eyes was a storm fear, frustration, and something else. Then slowly he nodded. It was a small nod, but it was permission. They would face this together. The door burst open. 2 soldiers stepped inside, weapons raised, behind them. More figures waited in the snow. The firelight flickered across their armor. One of them barked a question at Daniel. He answered calmly. Kareth stood still, her shoulders tense, her eyes locked on theirs. The soldiers' eyes swept the room. They noticed her instantly. One stepped forward, his weapon shifting toward her. Daniel moved between them, his hands up, speaking quickly. The soldier pushed him aside. Kareth felt the heat rise in her chest. She raised the shard slightly. The soldier hesitated. He spoke in a lower tone, almost like he was giving her a chance to surrender. Kareth's gaze flicked to Daniel. He was shaking his head no, but she could see it in his face. If she didn't act, they would take her, and Daniel might not survive their questions. She took a step forward. The soldier tensed. Her voice was rough, but she forced the human words she had learned. "No fight," she said. The soldier blinked. She repeated it, louder this time. "No fight." The room went still. Daniel looked at her in shock. She lowered the shard and opened her empty hand. It was a risk. A dangerous, stupid, life-changing risk. The soldiers exchanged a glance. Then slowly, they lowered their weapons. One muttered something under his breath. Another looked at Daniel, his eyes sharp. Daniel answered with a short, careful sentence. It must have been enough, because the soldiers backed toward the door. One gave Kareth a final long look before stepping outside. Then they were gone. Daniel closed the door quickly and locked it. For a long time he just stood there, breathing hard. Kareth leaned against the wall, her own heart racing. She didn't know if the danger was truly gone, but for now, they had survived. He turned to her, his voice low but full of emotion. He spoke a sentence she couldn't fully understand, but she caught 2 words, together and safe. She nodded once. It was all they needed. Kareth knew the soldiers would return again. She knew the danger was far from over, but tonight she had made her choice. She was no longer just someone Daniel was protecting. She was his ally, and she would fight beside him until the end. The storm outside had calmed by morning. The world was quiet, the snow lying thick and unbroken across the ground. Inside the small wooden house, Kareth sat near the fire, sharpening the same piece of metal she had held the night before. Daniel moved around the kitchen, his steps slower than usual. The tension of last night's encounter still clung to the air. They didn't speak much. Words weren't needed. They had faced the soldiers together and survived. That was enough, but Kareth knew something had changed. The soldiers had seen her. They had heard her voice. Soon, the entire settlement would know an alien was in hiding here. Daniel's home would no longer be safe. Neither would he. Later that day, Daniel spread a map across the table. He pointed to their current location, then to a spot deep in the forest, far from the settlement. Kareth leaned over, studying it carefully. It was far days of travel through cold and danger. But she understood his plan. They couldn't stay here any longer. She shook her head at first. The forest was not her world. Its shadows were unfamiliar, its animals unknown. But Daniel met her gaze with a steady look. His eyes told her he would not leave her behind. And slowly, she nodded. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Daniel packed food, water, blankets, and tools. Kareth checked her wounds, wrapping them tightly. She kept the metal shard at her side. It wasn't much, but it was hers. That night, before they left, Kareth stood by the fire one last time. She looked around the small room. It had been her cage, her shelter, And her strange new home. Here, she had healed. Here, she had begun to see humans differently. And here, she had learned trust. Daniel tapped her shoulder. It was time. They slipped out into the cold darkness. The snow crunched under their boots. Kareth moved quietly, her senses sharp. Every sound in the forest seemed louder in the silence of night. Owls called. Wind whispered through bare branches. Daniel led the way, but she stayed close by dawn. They had put distance between themselves and the settlement. The air was colder here. Frost clung to their clothing. They stopped only briefly to rest and eat. Daniel spoke little. Kareth spoke even less. But their silence was no longer heavy. It was steady, like a shared heartbeat. On the third night, they found a small abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It was falling apart, but its walls stood strong enough to block the wind. Daniel set up a small fire while Kareth kept watch outside. The forest was quiet, but she didn't relax. She knew the soldiers might still be searching. And if they found this place, there would be no running again. As the flames warmed the cabin, Daniel took something from his bag. It was the small metal box, the one with the photograph and pendant. He opened it, removed the pendant, and held it out to her. Kareth frowned. She had returned it before, but this time, he pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it. She didn't need words to understand. He wanted her to keep it, a symbol of trust, a promise between them. Kareth felt something in her chest she could not name. It was not the pride of a warrior. It was not the relief of survival. It was something warmer, something that made the cold night feel less biting. The days in the forest turned into weeks. They built a small life in the cabin, hunting for food, melting snow for water. Each day, Kareth's strength returned. She trained again, using branches as weapons. Daniel joined her sometimes, laughing. When she corrected his stance, the sound of his laugh stayed with her even when the nights grew long. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Kareth stood outside, looking at the horizon. She thought of her people, scattered and broken after the war. She thought of the humans in the settlement, driven by fear and orders. And then, she thought of Daniel, a human who had chosen to save her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. She realized then that the war she had fought all her life was not the only war that mattered. There was another war, the war inside. The one between hate and understanding, and in that war, she had already chosen her side. Daniel stepped out of the cabin and stood beside her. They didn't speak, they didn't need to, because in that moment, Kareth knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, they would face it together. Far away, beyond the forest, the world was still divided. But here, in this small clearing, an alien warrior and a human survivor had found something stronger than war. A bond that no army could break. Asterisk.